Thank you, Walid, and thank you for organizing an excellent conference. I have one criticism. There was no hashtag that I was aware of. So, was there? Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Anyway, well, he asked me to make some closing remarks. You already heard me, so I'm sorry. Not my decision to be here twice. He was blamed the program manager. But I put down some thoughts, which are partially some personal thoughts, because it may be of interest to tell you about some things in the world that I'm working in. So in the short 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, I can address some of these issues here. Because, of course, the world's changing, and the answer that you give to these could be quite different today compared to previously, and so on. So to start with, also trying to understand freedom of expression and press freedom in this new world. This is the kind of thinking that we are developing at UNESCO. I'm not completely convinced about it, but it's a way to try and make sense, because, as I said to the students yesterday, there was a time in history when press freedom and journalism were the same thing, and they were newspapers. That was it. And bit by bit, these have become more and more detached. And journalism not the same as newspapers, and press freedom is not the same as journalism, or is it? So basically, I think that one could say, in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can say freedom of expression is for everybody. Of course, it doesn't matter what you do, but you should be, entitled to that. And that I think one can say that press freedom is not just the use of media, but it's the use of media to do journalism. And it needs protection, because a lot of freedom of expression, it may need protection also, like artistic freedom of expression, but journalism is probably the most sensitive, ongoing, regular, contested terrain. Of course, how do you define journalism? But I think we can say it's different to fictional expression, it's different to marketing expression, for example, advertising and so on. And that for press freedom, you need, of course, legal media freedom, but you also need more, because if you don't have these other components of pluralism, independence, and safety to practice press freedom, then you don't really have press freedom. This is something that increasingly has been recognized, I think, internationally, particularly since 1991 with the Windhoek Declaration that said press freedom must be, all these things. To go a bit now into also the independence part, because I think this is quite important, because freedom of expression doesn't mean you have to adhere to journalistic ethics. When you're free to express, you can boast, you can lie, except if you're committing fraud. You can exaggerate. You can do all kinds of things. Freedom of expression. That's not you can be unfair. But if you're journalism, you voluntarily set up some standards for yourself, and then hopefully you should live up to those standards and have mechanisms to do that. And why I think it's important to look at this is because very often people look at press freedom from the top. What is the state doing to stop press freedom? But when you look at this independence question, you're also looking from the bottom. What are journalists doing to push for that component of press freedom? Because some journalists are not living up to the independence standards. But you start looking at many are, and that's what's pushing and forcing that press freedom to be relevant. We touched on this earlier, I think Nicholas Lundblad did also, but in terms of the international perspectives on freedom of expression, the norm should be freedom of expression and press freedom. Press freedom is a derivative of the freedom of expression, but it should be the norm. And basically, all rights, limitations should be the exception. Okay, so if you're going to limit freedom of expression in terms of privacy, like defamation, or in terms of invasion of privacy, and so all these things, it can't be the kind of ongoing thing. And to be justifiable, this is why I was banging on about the question of law with surveillance, because if you're going to limit stuff, it must be there, it must be transparent that these are the limitations, must be in law, must be rule-based, must be necessary, proportionate. In other words, if you're going to limit content because you think it's inciting violence or hate, do ban the whole platform, the whole of YouTube, just because of one video. That's disproportionate. And it's the whole question of legitimate purpose. So these are the ways in which any limitations should be evaluated. It's part of what Nicholas Lundblad said. Certain surveillance can be legitimate if it meets these criteria. Surveillance can be an invasion of privacy, a limit on privacy, and a limit on freedom of expression, and a limit on the right to association. Is it legitimate? Does it meet these criteria? So I think this kind of thinking helps us understand a little bit about where does journalism fit into this new world. So that's about the global journalism to an extent. Now I come to the question of who is a journalist, who is the bearer of the role. Now, I'm not going to go into this whole debate in great detail, but just to tell you, in the UN system, it's quite interesting because at UNESCO, it was agreed by the member states to have this formulation, that the people who are most affected by press freedom, who really need protection for safety, are journalists, media workers, and social media producers. Not every social media producer is as important as those who are producing social public interest journalism. So it's quite an interesting niching, I think, of the thing. The UN General Assembly last year, they made this statement that they recognize journalism is evolving. So it's not just the media institutions now, it's also private individuals, even some organizations, which are not even 100% media organizations, are producing some journalism. So I think that helps us understand that all those who do journalism are not necessarily journalists, but they're still doing journalism. So we need to have that nuance. When you come then to what do they do, the global journalism, Peter, I don't know if he's still here. Anyway, he touched on this, so I think he's more of an expert than me, but I did some work on this some time ago, and I'll show you in a minute. But I don't want to be academic, but it's important to understand these things, because what kind of business are you going to be in? Are you in the business of global journalism, transnational journalism, international journalism, local journalism? This is quite an important question, because it depends how you frame things and who your audience is, etc. And I think it used to be the case if you were doing local journalism, it was for a local audience. Now you can do local journalism for a local audience, but people may get really interested in foreign audiences. So what does that make it? Is it now foreign journalism? So I came with a kind of a grid, which I wrote an article in 2009 when I used to be an academic. And I won't spend your time going into it, but if you're interested in this thing, trying to figure out how things play, what point of view you bring, I thought you can examine things from the point of view of the production. Where is it produced? Okay. What is the nature of the text? This is Peter's approach, particularly how are you constructing the text and what's in the content. Where is it distributed to and who's the audience? And then you can begin to figure out a little bit how these things work, bearing in mind all the time that these categories are not fixed. One bit of news can actually play in different categories because of this crazy thing called the internet. But still, we could try to think, what is the primary emphasis? What is the primary angling? Who's the primary audience? What's the primary source of content? So in this new age, trying to kind of configure journalism, I think we can use something like this. So I want to just begin to end up and tell you about, I think that the whole context of global journalism and regional journalism is very important for us to understand because of these changes. And this here refers to a publication that has just come out at UNESCO, which has global trends and regional trends. There was a panel of about 30 experts from around the world who helped us put this together. And it covers press freedom in these areas, the media freedom, pluralism, independence, safety of journalists, and gender. And I'll give you a snapshot of what's in that, because it's quite interesting to try and, if you were to average out the whole world, which of course is probably an impossible and unscientific thing to do, but what more or less can you say is happening on a global basis, given that regional things are often different, and some regions are different. This report, I thought this was also interesting too. Where does this report come from? You may know of an academic called Ulla Carlson, so from Gothenburg. She is in the UNESCO National Commission. She came to UNESCO and she said, you must do a study on world trends in freedom of expression and media development. And all the governments agreed with her, hence we had to do this big study. This is the very interesting thing. So if you're not in the National Commission, get involved and you can make history. So we had to do this study. So on the freedom side, I'll just quickly touch on some of these trends in the freedom. So this is mainly the legal freedom from the top. The legal guarantees for freedom of expression, press freedom, they're there in many constitutions. Governments are signing up to international instruments, but often they say subject to the law. Instead of making the law subject to the right, they make the right subject to the law, and then the law undermines that. You know that. The international treaties, more and more countries have ratified these international treaties. It becomes an important point of leverage to say, okay, well, now you're part of the international community, let's go with that. The good news is that defamation laws are more and more becoming decriminalized. So defamation still exists, but it's not a criminal offense. It's not for the state to investigate. I'm getting signs from the speaker. So anyway, I'll just touch more, sorry, from the chair. Freedom of information laws is growing licensing. Okay, so anyway, if you look at this book, you can get all these trends. So I'm not going to go through them. Pluralism, we looked at pluralism. What are the trends in access? What are the trends in ownership? And what are the trends in content? So I'm going to go through those. Gender is a big study. What's happening in pluralism with gender on the internet? Independence, I mentioned this a bit earlier. So the state licensing of journalism is increasing, including online journalism. Media economics are being affected by the state abuse, so it reduces independence. Regulatory bodies are being, they're still not independent enough. Self-regulatory systems are weak. So these are quite important issues. I think we should understand about this balance of the components that make up press freedom. On the safety side, I'll just finish with something. Unfortunately, crimes against journalists remain the norm. So according to the statistics here, UNESCO, the head of UNESCO asks governments to report on what is happening when a journalist is killed. In this period, 410 journalists were killed worldwide over those 5 years. Of the countries where those were killed, only 42% sent in information. Okay? The others didn't send the information. Of the statistics, only 1% of these 410 were actually resolved. The killer was brought to justice. This is why you can see it's so important to have the 2nd of November. Okay. So anyway, to end off also, let me go through here. There are some global networks that are developing, which I think you might be interested to know. The two here that UNESCO is quite involved in is a global forum on media and gender, because the gender question in press freedom still has a long way to go. And then media and information literacy, GAPMIL, GAP, that's Global Alliance for Partnerships in Media Information Literacy, which we haven't really spoken about, but can you speak of global media, global journalism without the public being exposed to how to protect their safety, how to find information, how to critically evaluate information, how to contribute in a way that's maybe journalistic. So these are the two alliances there. So anyway, I've just said in this presentation, there's global journalists, there's global journalism, they're changing. If you put it in the context of the changing world trends, and I gave you some global responses. Thank you, Wally.